Chapter 20. This is Your Life. Chapter 20. This is Your Life. "Tim!" Pete shot, beating on my door. I grimaced, looking at the clock before forcefully sitting up and groggily walked across the floor and answered the door. "Pete?" I asked, shielding my eyes as the sudden exposure of the hall light blinded me. The boy walked around me beaming. I sleepily followed him into my room. I sat at my computer desk while he sat on my bed. He smiled from ear to ear. "I can literally die now," he responded, falling back with extended arms. I rubbed my eyes and yawned, exhausted, before leaning back in my seat. "I'm guessing at some point you're going to tell me what has you so happy. If the rings under my eyes aren't a big enough indicator, I'm hoping it's sooner rather than later," I responded, prompting him to continue. "Oh, sorry," he chuckled, sitting up. He rubbed his hands together before exhaling, shaking his head, still in a state of disbelief. "She kissed me!" he gushed happily, moving his hands up and down with a chuckle. His words quickly knocked me out of my funk. I sat forward, immediately pressing the kid. "Who?" I pressed, blown away. "Sai!" he responded, leaping to his feet. His words caused my heart to beat out of my chest. I stared at him with a feeling in the pit of my gut that I wanted gone, but at that moment, I was confused and I needed clarification. "Sai? Sarai? Hikari? She kissed you?" I pressed, needing to confirm the unbelievable story. "Yeah, well, it was on the forehead and cheek, but she practically said she would love it if she had a boyfriend like me," he continued. "Can you believe it?" I shook my head, unable to congratulate the boy because of the confusion from his story. "Wait, can we go back?" I asked, annoyed. "You're all over the place." Pete calmed himself, nodding, trying to quell his euphoria. "Sorry. Yeah, where do I start?" he responded, fidgeting excitedly. "Well, Sam was driving me crazy. I stepped out to get away from him, and I just ran into her. She was crying." His words caused my eyebrows to furl in confusion. "Sai was crying?" I pressed, concerned. He continued explaining the entire incident, both the highs and lows. When he finished, he was still beaming. "Pete, from what it sounds like, and I promise I'm not trying to rain on your parade with this, but it doesn't appear like she was on the same page as you on this thing," I uttered, feeling like a heel. I wanted to tell him the kiss meant as much as he thought it did, but the truth was, Sai's actions screamed a lack of infatuation that Pete's obsession with the girl caused him to miss. I didn't want the boy to get his hopes up for nothing. "I'm not an idiot, Tim. I get it. But even if that is the case, I have at the very least a sign that she could see me in a romantic capacity," he gushed. "I think your plan worked. Danny mentioned something about her being wrong about Beth's relationship, and she literally said she felt like she missed an opportunity and she may never get the chance again. It worked!" He leaped up, hugging me happily, nearly kissing me as I politely gave him a congratulating pat. I exhaled once again, unable to understand my fear for the boy. I had a need to tell him the risk, and it was like I couldn't stop myself. "Pete, I understand you're excited, but we both know about Sai's thing for Jacob. It's hard to believe it could be gone so abruptly," I pressed, causing him to shake his head vehemently. "I know we don't believe her, but she did say she didn't like Jacob. It's a good possibility we just assumed her admiration for the guy went deeper," he responded with a shrug. I nodded, taking in his words with a sorrowful gravity that I couldn't understand. Regardless, Did she ever tell you why she was crying? I cut in, yawning once again. No, but I think it had something to do with some letter she had in her hand, he responded with a shrug. A letter? I followed up. Yeah, it had your name on it, actually, he responded, scratching his head. She said something about them pushing her to date or something. Maybe them proposing you to her was the straw that broke the camel's back. She said she felt stupid and unattractive. It was similar to the day a couple years ago where I choked and lost my chance with her. He lowered his head, stopping himself, not wanting to expose the secrets he and the girl shared. Sai, she's more sensitive than she lets on. She just hates for people to see it. My guess is that's what happened. I didn't press, so it's the best I can do, he continued. All I know is I'm going to keep it up a little while longer, just until I'm sure. I nodded as a part of me felt relieved. The guilt for that feeling was overwhelming as the boy patted me on the back, pumping a triumphant fist. I'm sorry for waking you, Tim. I just had to come and thank you, he responded, walking out the door as he finished his sentence. I stared in a haze. I was upset by Pete's words and I couldn't understand it. Sai was my best friend. Pete had a crush on her for as long as I knew him. I should have been overjoyed, but all I felt was depression, and I couldn't wrap my head around the rationale behind the negative feelings I have. I finally had Eve. Sai and I were friends. In our relationship, there wasn't any confusion about that. But the truth was, no matter how often the girl stated she didn't have romantic feelings for Jacob, I knew her. He was the one and only boy I saw her act strange around, and our battle with the Jinn all but proved it. The Jinn specifically said they tracked the girl using her lust, and Jacob was the only other person besides Luke with the girl. Nothing made sense. Listening to Pete's words, I couldn't make heads or tails of anything. It took me a while to get to sleep as I tossed and turned, wrestling with feelings of guilt and depression throughout the night until my alarm clock awoke me. I took the extra time usually reserved for watching the Light Guard trial analysis and slept. I got ready and shot out of the room, making a beeline straight for the transport, dodging by reporters as I made my way on the transport. I stood in an awkward position. Both Eve and Sai had open spots next to them, arms I was genuinely confused about which one to sit by. Normally it would have been Sai, but now with my relationship with Eve, I was torn. Eve made things easier as she marched over and hugged me. "Morning, Tim," she greeted happily. She showcased a smile that ensnared me. She kissed me on the cheek, moving her head to the side just enough for me to get a glimpse at Sai. She quickly, uncomfortably jostled, angling her view away from us. I blushed, still falling between guilt and embarrassment. "Danny needs my help with an elemental technique. I just wanted to make sure I greeted you before I went in to help her," she gushed, kissing me on the cheek as I smiled, still smitten with the girl. She gave me another hug before heading to the training room. Pete and the older guys were camped in the back, talking strategy. I sat down next to Sai. She continued to stare out the window, ignoring my presence as I awkwardly nestled in next to her. "Well, good morning, Miss Hikari," I shot, trying to break the ice. She turned toward me with a look that fell between indifference and annoyed. It surprised me as she nodded instead of speaking before turning her gaze back to the window. "Sai, is everything okay?" I responded nervously. She continued to stare out the window, obviously holding back emotion as she responded. She jostled for a second before relenting with a frustrated sigh. "Tim, why didn't you tell me you and Eve started dating?" she responded, surprising me. It was the last thing I expected to hear. I fumbled to answer her apologetically. Oh, that. I'm sorry, with the trials and Eve's hearing, it just slipped my mind, I responded. Truthfully, I forgot. She covertly rolled her eyes, showcasing frustration at my words. From the position of her head, I couldn't see it, but I did pick up on the tension in her shoulders as she continued. You forgot? She responded with a scoff. It never occurred to you that dynamic might change things between us? There is nothing in you that felt I would want to know that? Her words sounded heavy, and at the time, even I was mature enough to understand the double meaning in her words. But after Pete's story, my mindset had already filled in the blanks. Come on, Sai, I was going to tell you, I responded defensively. But seriously, you have to admit it's not the most important thing going on in our lives right now. She chuckled facetiously, turning back to me, showing visible disappointment in her eyes as she continued. Our bond is important to me, Tim. I know it shouldn't be as important as it is, and it shouldn't be on my mind in the midst of this crazy roller coaster ride we're on, but the truth is, it is. I can't see how you don't get why. I don't know how you could just change that bond and think it wouldn't affect me. I know you miss obvious things on the regular, but there was a part of me that thought I was more important to you, she continued vaguely, spilling her soul. I sat, trying to piece together her words in an order that made sense. Of course, I should have taken in account how getting a girlfriend would change the dynamic of our relationship, but I had every intention of telling Sai. Sai, it won't affect our relationship, I promise, I responded, placing my hand on her shoulder. She jerked away, placing a shielding hand between us in protest. Tim, if you believe that, then... She paused, stopping herself. She paused, giving me a pleading look, almost begging me to understand what she was trying to say, but it fell flat with the understanding I had, especially with the addition of Pete's story. Just forget it, she shot with a sorrowful sigh. It was obvious she was holding back tears as she stared out the window once again. Sai, why are you taking things so negatively? I messed up, sure, but you're overthinking it. Honestly, with the way you're acting, it's almost like you're jealous or something, I blurted, more begging the question than asking it. She turned to me with a squinting, offended glare. Jealous? She responded with a chuckle. Why would I be jealous? I shrugged with a dense, passive look on my face. I don't know. You tell me, I continued, lowering my voice so we wouldn't be overheard. Pete said the thought of the girls putting us together frustrated you to the point that it made you cry last night. I'm sorry, Sai. No one is good enough for you, and there's nothing wrong with having principles that you live by, but I'm not dumb enough to see why no one measures up. The rest of us aren't as thick as you think. I'm happy you want to remain single until you get to an age where you can go after the love of your life. I wish I could do that with you, but that's not what I want. She stared at me, thrown by the accusations. That wasn't what happened, Tim, she shot angrily. So they weren't trying to match you up with people last night? I pressed. Yes, but... she managed before I cut her off. And they didn't end up frustrating you with the thought of the two of us being, more than friends? I pressed angrily. And it wasn't just me, was it? Everyone they chose you turned down, didn't you? Yes, Tim, but it wasn't because Pete, he made the wrong assumption. I wasn't upset over that. I was... She shook her head, stuck between the truth and appearances, pausing as she rubbed her temples in frustration. I stared around subconsciously, continuing, mindful of the volume of my voice. Sai, I don't know what our bond means to you, but I promise it means a lot to me. I wouldn't do anything to jeopardize it. I don't want things to change between us, but I also understand at some point it will. We're getting older, And I know you don't plan on dating anytime soon, but that doesn't mean you don't want to. I just wish you would just stop with the tomboy act and admit how you feel, about boys. You have eyes. You have attraction to a boy. I don't know why you won't just come out and say it. It drives me crazy, I responded, pressing the girl before leaning back uncomfortably as I finished my sentence. She nodded aggressively, leaning forward, continuing to whisper as she responded. Well, maybe if this boy gave me any indication other than vague mixed signals, I'd have the courage to do that, she shot furiously. Oh, come on, why would he? You're invisible to him unless he presses you on an issue or he needs something from you. You're so good at hiding behind this facade. He would have to be a mind reader to recognize which signals are mixed, I whispered forcefully, meeting her anger with my own. She stared at me, scoffing, offended by my words. What do you want me to say to that, Tim? She shot angrily. I don't know. Maybe the truth for a change. If you want to make believe you're too mature for an adolescent relationship, that's fine. But if you have a crush on someone, you should let that person know, because there are other people who may be collateral damage that don't want to sit around waiting to be heartbroken, I fired, thinking of Pete immediately. Those people don't deserve that. Sai leaned back, sighing, instantly thinking of Eve as guilt filled her. Tim, you really think that's an easy thing to do? She shot, turning to me with an exaggerated chuckle. Have you ever stopped to think I want to? It's more to it than that. This could forever change the relationship I have with this person. If I tell him how I feel, I'm afraid he won't feel the same. If that happens, the relationship we currently have will never be the same. I nodded sympathetically, accepting her words. Sai, he'd be crazy to pass up the chance to be with someone like you. Trust me, I know how special you are, and, as annoying as it is to say, my brother is too smart to overlook someone as amazing as you, I shot, chuckling. She chuckled along with me before stopping herself as my word finally sunk in. Wait, what did you say? She shot, turning to me with a confused look on her face. Did you say your brother? I chuckled, placing my hand on hers in an assuring manner. Like I said, I know you, I responded with a smile. You obviously are holding back feelings, and my guess is you're jealous that Eve and I are moving forward and you'll be stagnant in your own situation. I get that, but I'm not going to leave you high and dry. I promise, nothing's going to change. We're still the dynamic duo. Where I go, you go. Eve's my girlfriend, not my best friend. That bond isn't going anywhere. She shook her head, moving to respond, but before she could, the transport stopped, catching our attention. Tim? She whispered urgently, trying to speak as Max stood, cutting her off. She grimaced angrily as my attention turned to the angel. She desperately waited for a lull in the commotion to speak to me again, but Jacob chose me and Zach to be his advisors, causing us to leave immediately. I gave her a wink as I turned to leave. She returned my gesture uncomfortably, unable to clear the air with our new audience of people around. I exited, so used to the routine that I completely ignored the crowd as I made my way to the barrier and into the advising room. It's awesome in here, Zach responded, surveying the layout. The cold feel of the stadium matched the look on Jacob's face as he made his way to the center of the stadium. The crowd was at a standstill, waiting as impatiently as we were to see what Jacob could do. The only one who looked unamused by the moment was Howell. He stood downwind with a look that fell between nervous and scared. I felt for the kid, and at that moment I could tell he knew he was in over his head. The whole time the referee gave them the briefing, he stood staring at Jacob, trying his best to make eye contact. But the entire time, it was painfully obvious he was intimidated. "This is so cool," said Zach, spinning in his chair next to me. "Come on, Zach," I complained, annoyed. "We can at least pretend we have a reason for being here." He looked at me like I had a screw loose. "What? He doesn't need us," he replied, still spinning in his chair. "This kid is about to get his butt kicked." I turned around as he leaped out of his seat and started running around the room. As powerful as he was, it was hard to see him as a child, but now it was annoyingly obvious. "Zach, sit down," I replied. "Stop playing around in here. You might break something." I couldn't understand why Jacob chose us to begin with. I know it wasn't much anybody could advise Jacob on, but at least Uriah and Luke could have given him something. We were just watching. Well, I was watching. Zach was playing. "I wonder what this does," he replied, surveying an encased button. "I don't know, but the anti-anointment metal lock is giving me strong vibes it shouldn't be touched," I replied, exasperated. He looked at me with a mischievous smile. "But you can open it," he replied in a pleading manner. I cut my eyes at him. I was beginning to understand the annoyance of having a little brother. "Zach, come sit down. The match is about to begin," I commanded, turning toward the screen. "Why doesn't anybody ever do an undertaking?" he replied, plopping on his seat. "I like undertakings, but outside of you and Pete, no one did one. If I get picked, I'm doing one. I don't care if I win or lose, because even if I lose, I'll beat whoever wins the relic anyways." I rolled my eyes as he continued with all the annoyances of a hyped-up kindergartner. As he did, Jacob and Howell nodded, signaling the beginning of the match. I sat forward intently as Zek flashed, causing his seat to spin. When it finally stopped, he stared at the arena, impatiently waiting for the match to start. "Here we go!" he exclaimed, slapping the console. "Finally," I expressed, leaning back. Jacob stood in his stance, unflinching as Howell backed up. He forced a stern stare, but it was laughably done. Everybody in the stadium could see the kid was afraid. The two of them stared at each other for a lasting minute, as if to be trying to psych the other out. Jacob didn't flinch as the kid reached and pulled out a boomerang from its sheath. Just as Howell went into his fighting stance, Jacob raised his hand to stop him. The kid stood startled for a second, then lowered his weapon. "What?" he replied, raising his hands, annoyed. Jacob walked toward him calmly as Howell watched him suspiciously. "I've watched you fight. You're a good fighter," he explained, stopping as he started his speech. "I think the Light Guard Academy would be better served to have you. So to make sure you get the proper platform to showcase your ability, I'm going to give you a choice. You can forfeit now and withdraw your challenge, giving you the opportunity to participate in the possible trial duel in the event that there is one." Howell began to laugh at the olive branch in a disrespectful manner. "Who are you two?" "I'm not finished," Jacob replied, cutting him off. His eyes lit up at the sound of his words, causing Howell to drop to one knee. His power was crippling. I could see it rippling through the stadium as people fainted and dropped like flies. "Whoa!" Zek replied, smiling as he turned to me. "Awesome! Just his faith energy did that!" I nodded, staring forward as Jacob stood over the kid like a parent scolding a child. "Your second option is to hit me with everything you got for 5 minutes, and at the end of those 5 minutes, I'll end the trial," he replied, powering down. As he powered down, Howell stumbled to his feet. He stared at Jacob like he was looking at an anomaly he couldn't crack. "How? What are you?" he replied, staring Jacob in the eye. Jacob cut his eyes as he turned his back. "I'm a Christian," he replied, walking back to his spot. "What are you?" As he spoke, an envious glare appeared on Howell's face. He pulled his boomerang from his back, infuriated. "I wanted to fight you, but if you're stupid enough to just sit there, I'll just have to show you why taking me lightly is a bad idea," he shot. Swoosh! He threw his boomerang. Boom! It circled and danced in the air for a couple of seconds. It caused an air pocket that swirled until it formed a mini tornado. Boom! It sputtered for a second, then crashed and collided into nearby pillars. "Did you see that, Tim? You created a tornado with his boomerang!" Zek gushed. Swoosh! The boomerang was connected to him like a magnet. Swoosh! It returned to his hand as a smile grew on his face. Swoosh! He tossed it at Jacob, once more creating another small tornado. As quickly as he caught the boomerang, he was sending it back. The arena was covered with small tornadoes, destroying everything inside it. "Scared yet?" he questioned, staring at Jacob. "You sure you don't want to rethink things?" Jacob stared forward, unmoved by the events going on around him. "Your funeral," Howell replied. "Converge!" As he finished his words, all the tornadoes began to move in unison. They cut across the terrain with one single path. The tornadoes converged until they created one large and massive tornado. Jacob stood downwind, unflinching, as he watched the massive monstrosities spinning out of control, heading straight for him. "You wanted the best I got?" Howell continued confidently. "Well, here you go." Boom! The tornado crashed into Jacob with stadium-shaking power. The intimidating tornado was bigger than anything I ever attempted in my limited time as a remnant. Jacob wasn't lying. This kid was powerful, and with the way he used his boomerang to create the tornadoes, it was obvious he was transferring his anointment into it. It was obviously a metaphysical trait. I didn't know if it would be possible to obtain the trait. I didn't know if which theory was right. Jacob's theory about sacrifice being the key, or Jade's assumption about my will to outdo people. The truth was, both allowed me to obtain traits. I didn't know which method was the key, but I knew I had to remember the trait for either one to work, just in case I somehow got a hold on the ability in the future. It might come in handy later. "Jake, are you okay?" I asked, unable to see him as the tornado raged on. There was no reply. It just raged on for a couple of seconds before Howell chuckled and moved his hand, causing the tornado to disperse. As he did, the crowd watched in awe. Jacob was nowhere to be found. Howell added, chuckling proudly. "I guess I overdid it. I must have sent him out of the stadium." Flash! Jacob appeared within earshot, standing right behind him, breaking the boy's prideful exhibit. 4 minutes, Jacob warned. Swoosh! Flash! Howell spun around, swinging at thin air as Jacob reappeared across the field. He spun around, swinging like a wild man. It was almost like he was fighting a ghost, as he swung wildly at the air as Jacob watched him from across the field emotionlessly. 3.5, Jacob shot, signifying his position to Howell. Howell grunted, pulling out a second boomerang that was identical to the first, as he turned to my brother in a threatening manner. "Okay, no more games. Element Alpha, light energy command, static charge," Howell commanded, extending his hands, causing the boomerangs to spin like 2 small fans. The static electricity around him sparked wildly, until it looked like he had 1,000 electric arms that extended throughout the stadium. Zip! He moved his hands, causing the spinning boomerangs to spark like 2 tiny lightning bolts. Whoosh! He powered them up until they flickered loudly, creating a lightning storm. "Okay, catch this," he threatened, tossing the boomerangs. Boom! Howell sent his hands forward in a striking motion, sending the boomerangs toward Jacob. They settled high above his general area like a storm cloud. Crack! Crack! Static electricity rained down like lightning, sparking all around Jacob. He stood stoically. His arms were crossed in front of his chest as he moved around the arena, appearing and reappearing in different spots. "Where are you?" Howell screamed, frustrated. He continued to send strikes toward Jacob, but no matter how fast he sent them, Jacob just dodged them like child's play. 3 minutes, Jacob replied, light stepping across the field, appearing behind him once again. Ah! Boom! He exploded with energy, like a bomb trying to obliterate everything in its vicinity. He was angry and unstable as the electricity became a part of his armor in a manner similar to the twins. "Who is this kid?" I asked, turning to Zek. Zek stared forward, kicking his feet back and forth like a kid with ADHD. "He's my cousin?" he replied, not even looking at me as he spoke. I stared at him, waiting for him to elaborate. "What?" he replied, shocked by my demeanor. I stared at him, irked by his dismissive words. "Don't you think I should have known that?" I fired, staring him up and down. He perked up at the sound of my words. "Oh, well, now you know," he replied, smiling obliviously. "Besides, I don't really know him. My father and his father are brothers, but I don't see him much because our fathers don't like each other. I think they were in the same mogul business or something." I gave a nod as I watched the boy continue to absorb the solid elements scattered around the arena into S.H.I.E.L.D. I turned to Zek, pressing him. "So that's why he can use that technique?" I asked, causing the boy to smile from ear to ear. "But he's a cheater like Joe. He's an elemental," he shot proudly, sticking out his chest. "That's why Jacob wanted me to train with him. He wanted to see how our family technique worked. And I'm such a nice person, I said okay. Pretty good thing to do, huh?" "Yes, your selfless nature inspires me, Zek," I mocked with a sarcastic sigh, leaning back as the boy smiled ignorantly. I turned back to the center of the arena, ignoring the boy as the battle raged on. Howell continued to send shots at Jacob, who continued to dodge as sparks erupted all around him. 1 minute, Jacob replied over the loud crash of Howell's attack. Howell raised his hands angrily, causing the terrain underneath Jacob to rise into a mountain. Jacob stood on top of it like a pirate at the helm of his ship. Whoosh! Howell angrily tossed fireballs toward him in a last-ditch effort. Whoosh! Whoosh! He frantically tossed fireballs toward the mountain, as Jacob appeared and reappeared at different spots, dodging them effortlessly. "Time's up," Jacob replied in a calm and controlled voice. The mountain exploded like it was hit by an atom bomb. The explosion was deafening. The area around the mountain collapsed at the sound of Jacob's word. There was debris everywhere. Howell stood, unable to move as he watched in awe. "You have got to be kidding me!" I exclaimed, watching in awe. When Jacob reappeared, he stood with his arm reaching over his back, grasping the huge sword that lay on his back. "I gave you the opportunity to showcase your power. Now it's time for me to showcase mine," he replied, unlatching and pulling the large sword off his back. The sheer power that exploded from the moment he pulled the sword from its sheath was ridiculous. I could feel his power surge through everything. It was glowing like a lantern in the dark. The explosion was so powerful that it crippled half the stadium, sending a crack along the stadium wall. "Awesome!" Zek replied, clapping hysterically. "Jacob's awesome!" Howell stumbled, trying with everything he had to remain standing as Jacob approached. Jacob hadn't touched him. It was just his presence alone. I couldn't believe what I was watching. The closer he got to Howell, the worse it became. Howell fell to his knees, then crawled in an attempt to get away, as Jacob walked toward him sternly with a sword that was as big as he was. I stared at him in awe. Was it the sword? Was that what made him so powerful? I thought, the jealousy rising with every passing second. How could he be so powerful? I raged, jealously watching as I tried to come to grips with what I was seeing. This trial is over, Jacob replied, flash-stepping in front of him, blocking his path. The momentum of his speed caused a wall directly behind him to explode like someone torpedoed into it. Howell fell on his stomach, fighting to raise his head, as Jacob continued his march toward him. "What am I supposed to do, Dad?" Howell responded, startling us. "There is nothing I can do." Even Jacob seemed taken back by his words. His brow raised, stopping his march momentarily. Howell slowly raised his gaze and stared at Jacob in a pleading manner. "How can you do this?" he questioned, taking the words out of my mouth. "What makes your faith energy this dense?" Jacob cut his eyes, stopping to respond. "The people in this realm are under the assumption that since you're born here, you somehow have an advantage over us Earthborn," Jacob replied, tossing his sword into its sheath. "In some ways, you're right. We have a harder time taking the truth at face value because we are so used to the terrible things in life. But consequently, those same terrible experiences build our faith. Even though we work at a beginning deficit, once we gain our faith, it's stronger. What we lack in initial power, we gain in experience. You guys don't have the same experiences to draw upon. You can't use the same hardships we do to help you gain faith in Father Yahweh. Even though you guys believe you can do amazing things, you're limited by the same societal norms you believe makes you so special. We have no idea what our limitations are, because we have overcome so much already. When that is your reality, nothing seems impossible." Howell stared at Jacob for a lasting second before passing out. Jacob latched his sword in, as the crowd erupted so loud the stadium began to shake. The Earthborn section was a frenzy, jumping up and down proudly. I stood with jealousy in the pit of my stomach. It burned like a fire in the furnace of my gut. Then I got it. I could see what she saw in him. I could see what they saw in him. I could never measure up to that. It made me feel numb. "He's so fast," Zek replied. "I never saw him, not once." I chuckled, thinking his words were a joke. "Are you serious?" I replied, turning to him. "He was just flash-stepping and dematerializing. I saw him the whole time." He looked at me as a smile grew on his face. "You could actually follow him?" he pressed, looking me in the eye. "That's so crazy. I never saw a move he made. I just heard Jacob's voice, then saw the explosions. Boom, boom, boom. It was awesome." He was joking. I lost Jacob for a second or two, but for the most part I followed him. It had to be Zek's short attention span. I shook it off, then grabbed my things to head out as Jacob walked toward the council to get his debriefing. "Let's go," I commanded, heading toward the door. Zek quickly grabbed his things and trailed me outside. As we exited the room, I was bombarded by the excitement of the rest of the Legion, who were celebrating like we had just won the whole thing. "Tim," Eve replied, giving me a hug, "have you ever seen anything like that?" Considering 99% of the things I've seen in the last week would fall under that generic title, it doesn't seem to give the proper justice to what I just witnessed, I responded, almost agitated as I pushed my way to my seat. Before I could fully take a seat, Sam, Cy, and Pete joined Eve, tackling me in a group hug as Joe grabbed Zach. It was a stark contrast to the dull atmosphere from a couple minutes earlier. "Yeah, take that," Luke echoed, pumping his fist. "Whoa, man, it feels good to finally get another one." As they celebrated, Zach pulled my shirt, catching my attention. I turned to him as he continued. "Tell him, Tim, didn't you say you were able to follow Jacob? You actually saw him moving, right?" he replied, catching the attention of everyone in the room. I nodded, not understanding the importance of the question. "Tim, you actually saw Jacob fight?" Cy replied. Luke, Danielle, and Uriah walked toward me at the sound of Cy's word. "Yeah, what's the big deal?" I replied, agitated. "Everybody in the stadium just saw Jacob fight." They all looked at me with a look that was becoming a daily ritual for us. "No, Tim, we didn't," Pete replied, looking at me like I was an alien. "He was moving too fast," Uriah added. "He disappeared at the beginning, then reappeared a couple minutes later, and the kid was out." Sam stared at me before breaking in. "Tim's lying," he replied. "There's no way he was able to follow that. The announcers couldn't even do that." I stared at him like he was crazy. "Yeah, Sam, I made this up," I replied sarcastically. "I lost him for a second when he was on the mountain, but for the most part I saw everything." "Well, what happened?" Danielle cut in. They all stared at me like kids waiting for a bedtime story. "Yeah, did Jacob beat the crap out of the kid?" Luke responded. I shook my head, still trying to proceed while coming to grips with what I was being told. I couldn't understand it. "No," I stuttered. "He didn't touch the kid. It was all his faith energy. He was just using his speed and dematerialization the entire time. Then the 5 minutes ended and he pulled out that huge sword on his back. The kid fainted from the power of it. That's it. The end." They all continued to glare at me with a look that fell between impressed and confused, but nobody pressed me. I couldn't understand why I was able to follow him when nobody else could. "He's not lying," Uriah broke in. "I can tell from his biorhythm. He's telling the truth." "Whoa, yeah!" Luke exploded, clapping hysterically. "All right, Jake!" "Amazing," Cy seconded. "Your brother is ridiculous," Pete added. I rolled my eyes, grabbing my bag, needing to get away from the love fest. "Tim, come on, wait!" Cy replied, laughing, trailing behind me. "Yeah, we'll come with you," Eve replied, chuckling as well. Pete shook his head, realizing the reason for my abrupt exit as the rest of the Legion celebrated, ignoring me. The crowd was exploding as I walked out of our cell, angrily marching for the transport. For the first time since I arrived, I was once again the little brother of a prodigy. The label I thought I escaped came rushing back with a vengeance. I walked toward the bus with Cy, Sam, Pete, and Eve. The press exploded as we exited the building, only to subside when they noticed it was just us. "It's just the little brother and his friends," said one of the reporters. It was official. I grimaced, lowering my head, angrily throwing my hood over my head. They moved to the side, allowing us to pass like we were nobodies. Any other day, it would have been a welcome sight after a win, but the significance of their words wasn't lost on me. I swallowed a deep-seated annoyance that I was starting to realize would be around as long as I was Jacob's little brother. I walked on the bus and turned to the robotic driver. "Can we leave?" I replied angrily. "Don't you want to wait on your brother?" the transporter replied. "No, do you see that stadium? Jacob's going to be here all night," I replied, trying to bury my envy. "I'll catch him at the hotel." The transporter nodded, signaling he agreed as the rest of my company trailed me onto the bus. I stared out the window angrily as a crowd began to form awaiting Jacob. I could fight the deep-seated annoyance that ate at me, but the truth was, as long as I lived, my brother would always be the alpha. It was what it was. Take it or leave it, this was my life.